This presentation, or this lecture, covers Chapter 4 on pre-search filtering concerning the book Researching the Law, Finding What You Need When You Need It by Amy E. Sloan, published by Wolters Kluwer in 2014, I believe. Yes, 2014. So once you have articulated your research question and you have a list of research terms, your next step is to engage in pre-search filtering to focus your research. Your ultimate goal in most research projects, obviously, is to locate binding primary authorities, if they exist, to resolve your research question. If none exist, you may need to resort to secondary resources as discussed in the previous module of this course. Your research method and the tools you choose to search is determined by pre-filtering to determine the method and the tools you need to use in your research before you begin researching. Computer-assisted legal research strategies as well as print research strategies require you focus your research not just on the legal question, but where your legal question can be answered. Which sources are best for the job? In a physical library, you would make some decisions about what type of legal source is going to have the answer you need. The same is true of computer-assisted legal research. However, instead of walking from one stack of books to another in a library, with computer-assisted legal research, you decide what database is best used to find the relevant information and rules of law. And note that not only the books and the databases are very similar because they're published over 100 years in the same type of way. Maybe not the same format. One's obviously electronic and one is paper, but the format is going to be the same no matter what. On a very general level, that's true. All right, so to introduce this lecture, we're going to talk about how pre-search filtering affects your research, what the criteria is for pre-search filtering, and the process, a process that can be used for pre-search filtering. The first point, how does pre-search filtering affect research? As noted earlier, the goal of your research is to find binding primary authorities that support your research, and this drives the focus of your research. Just as with the physical library, the pre-search filtering helps guide you to the right stack of books. With computer-assisted legal research, it drives you to the right database. As with any legal question, you must ask yourself, what sources of law are most likely to have binding primary authority governing your research question or your issue, as we've also learned to call that research question. Choosing the stack of books or database is where we start our research after articulating our research question and deciding on search terms. However, this question is really not easily answered by every student. What may be obvious for some students will not be obvious to others. This decision as to what's going to drive your focus will depend on your prior knowledge of the type of research question, the sources you've learned are relevant to your research question, and the area of law you're researching. This is why it's important to embrace secondary legal sources, as we discussed in the past lecture. One of the important keys to successfully researching, especially for the novice researcher, is realizing that a penny saved is a penny earned. Pre-search filtering to decide on the best sources of information will narrow the initial results. As I've noted in some of my previous lectures, a search and destroy research method, one that takes place without pre-search filtering, will lead to frustration and wasted time. I sometimes call this the hamster wheel effect. One of the most important concepts for students in their first research class is to grasp, but there really are no shortcuts. So what is the criteria for pre-search filtering? In the law, one source is not as good as any other. For example, the type and weight of a legal authority affects how much attention, if any, you should give it when you're analyzing a client's situation, and in the post-search filtering that we're going to cover next. If a particular legal rule governs your client's situation, You must find the authority or authorities that contain that rule for your research to be accurate. I can't help but remind you of the landlord-tenant example I've told you about in some previous lectures. It's very fitting for this topic of the criteria. But the primary criteria for pre-search filtering includes the big three here: jurisdiction, type of authority, and subject area. Jurisdiction involves the legal rules that apply, and legal rules apply only to conduct occurring within the jurisdiction where the authority is in force. If Florida is the controlling jurisdiction, you know you need rules from Florida, not Wyoming. If you don't know the controlling jurisdiction, you can't use this as a basis for pre-search filtering. It's likely that your legal issue or your research question is in fact, actually the question of what jurisdiction controls the conduct. And there are some exceptions to that general rule. The type of authority plays a significant factor in pre-search filtering. If you know you need a specific form of primary authority, such as cases or statutes, you're able to limit your search to those sources. If you don't know, you should turn first to secondary sources to find out what type of authority you should consult. Making assumptions about the type of authority can be a huge time waster, and let me be frank with you, I recommend you research the statutes of the controlling jurisdiction first. And I recommend this because much of common law, for example, has been codified into statutes. But don't forget that statutes can also interpret, but that cases can also interpret statutes, and the courts may have, there'll be court opinions about that, and court opinions about the application of statutes to factual circumstances. And that's something that I talked about in a lecture prior to this. But the point of that is, going to statutes can help a lot as a beginning place. Subject area is the last of the big three. It can also help limit the scope of your research. If you know the general subject area the question falls into, for example, tort, civil procedure, intellectual property, employment law, etc., you can sometimes use that information to focus before you search. This is really relevant in deciding on what secondary sources to consult. For example, if you're researching an area of common law, after checking the statutes as I recommended, and you find that it, even if it has been codified in the statutes, you could also look to secondary sources such as the American Law Institute restatement on the same subject matter. Importantly, pre-search filtering will often, as the example illustrated that I just gave you, require centering on some combination of all three of these. Don't forget also that the textbooks you've saved from previous courses can also be helpful to your pre-search filtering decisions. For example, Chapter 3 of the Introduction to Paralegal Studies textbook has some food for thought on the sources of law, which is type of authority. And your civil litigation textbook can help you with some jurisdiction issues if you need to use the jurisdiction focus for your criteria. And your contracts book or your torts book can help you with subject area. So it's a good idea to save those whenever you can. Okay, so as to the objective of whether there is a process for pre-search filtering, let's try to visualize this process. And here on this slide is a variation of figure 4.2 of the Amy Sloan textbook, the copyright date 2014. And this is, there's a larger chart, a longer, bigger, a little more complicated chart on page 32, figure 4.2. And so what I've done is I've sort of distilled that chart a little bit, and I'm hoping it helps to better illustrate what the underlying questions the researcher is asking instead of the answers to the underlying questions, which is what figure 4.2 is doing. So the questions, of course, relate to the 4 areas across the top here: the pre-search filtering, basis for filtering, degree of confidence, confidence, and the search strategy. And the first column, pre-search filtering criteria, covers the controlling jurisdiction discussed in the previous slide. And the second column illustrates the questions that need to be answered by the researcher. Then this third column, degree of confidence, is going to be harder for some students than other students. I think this column requires a fairly high degree of legal analysis that you're still learning about and have to learn about more, and you'll do this as you progress through PLA 1104. Again, you can look at the examples on page 32 of the textbook and see if you're capable of it at this point in your paralegal studies. The fourth column is the result of the filtering process, and it describes the sources that the researcher will consult for the research. So this pre-filtering process requires, in most of your case scenarios, a good sum of legal analysis, and it also requires a good understanding of how the law is published, which is something that you'll learn more of in 1104 as you progress through that course. For now, I hope this chart sheds some light on the pre-filtering process in a format that is a little more distilled than what the 4.2 filtering chart has from the textbook. So, for controlling jurisdiction, the obvious question to form the basis for filtering by each criterion is, where did the event occur? And then you choose your degree of confidence. If you're certain, because you know that like in the situation of the smoker battery case, that it took place in a certain state, then your degree of confidence would be high. Some legal questions, it's harder to know the answer to that question without doing initial research, and that's a subject that we also will talk about in the next lecture for Chapter 5. Research sources, then, are the ones you want to choose from controlling jurisdiction. Obviously, you want binding primary authority from the controlling jurisdiction. All right, another category of pre-search filtering criteria is the subject areas. You have to ask yourself, what legal subject controls the event? Was it a torts or a contracts or criminal law? This just depends, clearly depends on the facts and the research question. And then you decide on the degree of confidence. And again, you may or may not know for certain, and but it at least tells you when you do know, even if you have to ask someone or do some secondary research to find out. Of course, you're looking for resources and those tools that have information about the area of law, the subject area of law, and that's published in the applicable area of law, obviously. Here, under pre-search filtering criteria, another category is type of authority. We have different types of legal authority. We can refer to cases and get court opinions. We can look to statutes for legislation. We can look to regulations for agency rules. And the basis for that is, obviously the question is, what information source will have these rules I need to find? And again, it always depends on the area of law and the types of authority typically consulted in an area of law. And your degree of confidence is shown here. And you decide if secondary authority is needed first to understand the rules that apply. So the research strategy would, in this case, in figure 4.2, the writer, she had medium, because of the possibility that cases may not explain entirely the problem. And so you decide if secondary authority is needed to first understand the rules that apply. All right, and we'll expand this list in the Chapter 5 lecture. So to conclude, we looked in this lecture about how pre-search filtering affects our research, what the criteria for it is, and a process for pre-search filtering. So that concludes this lecture. The next slide will have the reference.